Right now, inside the fuel tanks of hundreds of thousands of Piston aircraft parked at airports across this country, there is a substance that the Environmental Protection Agency has formally determined causes harm to human health. It has been formally determined. That is not a fringe opinion or an activist talking point. That is the official regulatory conclusion of the federal agency with the statutory authority to act on it. And the agency has signaled, clearly and repeatedly, that the era of 100 low-lead aviation gasoline, the fuel that powers the overwhelming majority of the Piston aircraft fleet in the United States, is coming to an end. Not maybe coming to an end, not theoretically on the table, coming to an end on a timeline that the people who run airports, fly airplanes, and own FBOs need to be paying attention to right now. Here is what makes this situation unlike almost any other transition story in the history of general aviation. There is no clean, fully ready, universally approved replacement that works for every airplane already in the fleet. Not one. There are candidates, there are efforts underway, there are approved fuels for certain engines, and there is genuine money and genuine engineering talent being thrown at the problem. But as of right now, sitting on the ramp with a fuel cap that says 100 low lead on the placard inside your airplane's cowling, you do not have a guaranteed works-for-everyone solution waiting in the wings. You have a complicated, fragmented, still-evolving picture that depends heavily on what specific airplane and engine combination you own, where you fly, how soon the regulatory and supply chain transitions actually happen in your region, and what choices you are personally able or willing to make in the meantime. I want to walk you through exactly what is happening here and why it matters for your wallet, your airplane's airworthiness, and your ability to keep flying in a way that most conversations about this topic completely skip past. Because most coverage of the Avgas transition either goes full doom, leaded fuel is getting banned, general aviation is finished, sell your airplane now, or goes full reassurance. The industry is working on it. Something will get figured out, don't worry about it. Both of those framings are wrong in important ways. The real picture is more complicated, more nuanced, and in some ways more immediately consequential than either extreme admits. Before we get into the details, hit subscribe. The topics I cover here are the ones that directly affect the financial decisions you're making as a pilot and aircraft owner, not airshow highlights, not destination features, the actual money questions, the ownership questions, the things that determine whether aviation stays affordable for you over the next 5 and 10 years. This is exactly that kind of video, and there is a lot more coming that you do not want to miss. Let's set the regulatory foundation first, because the entire story flows from it. The Clean Air Act gives the Environmental Protection Agency the authority to regulate fuels that contribute to air pollution and that have been determined to endanger public health. In 2022, the EPA made what is called an endangerment finding specifically for lead emissions from Piston aircraft engines. This is the formal, legally operative step that unlocks the agency's authority to regulate or prohibit a fuel additive. The same type of finding, applied to automobile fuel decades ago, eventually led to the elimination of leaded gasoline from the road vehicle market. The EPA applied that exact same legal framework to aviation fuel. That finding is on the books. It does not go away. It does not expire. It is the legal foundation from which everything that follows flows, and anyone who tells you this is still a theoretical future concern rather than an active regulatory process that has already taken a decisive initial step is not reading the situation accurately. What the endangerment finding does not do by itself is set a specific phase-out date or require a specific regulatory action by a specific deadline. The EPA still has to go through its full rulemaking process, which involves proposed rules, public comment periods, revisions, legal challenges, and eventual enforcement timelines. That process takes time, sometimes a lot of time, which is why the situation right now feels to some people like nothing is actually happening, even though the foundation for mandatory action has already been laid. The analogy I'd use is this. The foundation of the building has been poured. You cannot necessarily see from where you're standing exactly how tall the building will be or precisely when it will be finished, but if you think the concrete in the ground means nothing and construction isn't happening, you are going to be surprised when the building goes up around you. Now let's talk about what leaded aviation fuel actually is and why it has persisted this long, while leaded automobile gasoline disappeared decades ago, because that history matters for understanding why the replacement problem is hard. 100 low-lead aviation gasoline, 100LL, the stuff with the distinctive blue dye that identifies it at fuel pumps across the country, is the product of a very specific engineering requirement. High-performance piston aircraft engines, particularly those with higher compression ratios, operating at the power settings required for takeoff and climb in a fully loaded airplane on a hot day at a high-altitude airport, need a fuel with a high enough octane rating to prevent detonation. Detonation, also called knock, is what happens when the air-fuel mixture inside a cylinder ignites uncontrollably, rather than burning in the smooth, controlled progression the engine is designed around. Detonation can destroy an engine in seconds. For an airplane that is airborne over terrain with no place to land, an engine destroyed by detonation is not an inconvenience. It is potentially fatal. The lead additive in 100 low lead, specifically tetraethyl lead, is what gives the fuel its high octane number. It is extraordinarily effective at suppressing detonation. It has been refined and understood over decades. It distributes well through the existing fuel supply infrastructure, and it works reliably across an enormous range of ambient temperatures, altitudes, and engine conditions. There are other ways to achieve high octane ratings in liquid fuels: alkylate base stocks, ethanol blending, aromatic hydrocarbon blends. But replicating the specific performance characteristics of 100LL across the full range of engines and operating conditions in the existing piston fleet, without the lead, is genuinely difficult chemistry and engineering. It is not impossible. People are doing it, but it is not a simple drop-in swap, and the difficulty is real, which is why it has taken this long and why the solution has not arrived cleanly and universally, even after years of industry effort. Here is where the fleet composition picture becomes critically important, and this is a part of the story that gets lost constantly in the broad coverage. The piston aircraft fleet in the United States is not a monolithic thing. It is a collection of hundreds of different aircraft and engine type certificates, ranging from very small two-seat trainers with modest low-compression engines all the way up to large turbocharged six-cylinder engines in high-performance retractable singles and piston twins pulling real horsepower at altitude. Those different engine designs have meaningfully different fuel octane requirements, and the replacement solutions that work cleanly for one end of that range do not necessarily work cleanly for the other. The lower performance end of the fleet, smaller normally aspirated engines that are not running high compression ratios and are not demanding the full octane headroom that 100LL provides, can operate on fuels with lower octane ratings, including several alternatives that are already approved and increasingly available. For these engines and airframes, the transition path is clearer, and the urgency is somewhat different because a workable solution exists today for their specific requirements. If you own a low-compression two-seat trainer or a simple four-cylinder airplane that your pilot's operating handbook says can operate on lower-octane fuel, you are in a materially better position on this transition than the pilot next to you whose turbocharged high-compression engine genuinely needs every octane point 100LL provides. The harder problem is at the top of the performance range, the high-compression, high-output engines in heavier piston singles, piston twins, and high-performance retractables where the engine designers built in performance assumptions that rest directly on the fuel being 100 octane with the specific anti-detonation characteristics lead provides. For these aircraft and engines, the replacement story is not simple. The approved alternatives are fewer, and the stakes of getting it wrong, operating on a fuel that cannot reliably suppress detonation under all operating conditions, are directly connected to engine longevity and, in extreme cases, airworthiness. Let's talk about what has actually been approved and what is actually happening on the replacement side, because there is real progress here, and it deserves accurate representation. The FAA runs what is called the Piston Aviation Fuels Initiative, PAFI, which is a structured program to evaluate unleaded aviation fuel candidates against the performance requirements of the full piston fleet. PAFI has been running for years. It has produced meaningful technical data. It has also been slower and more complicated than optimists originally projected, because the engineering bar for approving an aviation fuel that works safely across the entire fleet is legitimately high. Aviation is not an environment where you get to issue a recall and tell people to stop driving for a few days while you figure out the problem. When you certify a fuel for use in a piston airplane fleet, you need extremely high confidence that it works correctly across every combination of engine, airframe, ambient condition, altitude, power setting, and operating scenario that airplane will ever actually encounter in service. The most significant development in the unleaded avgas space has been the approval process for G100UL, a fuel developed by General Aviation Modifications Incorporated, GAMI, which has been granted supplemental type certificates for its 100-octane unleaded formulation for specific aircraft and engine combinations. This is genuine, real progress. GAMI has done serious engineering work, has navigated a difficult FAA approval process, and has demonstrated a viable pathway for a 100-octane unleaded fuel that can serve a meaningful portion of the high-performance fleet. The challenge is that an STC-based approval path, airplane by airplane and engine by engine, is slow and expensive to scale across a fleet with thousands of distinct type certificate combinations. The ideal outcome for the transition, a single broadly approved unleaded fuel that any piston airplane can simply use the way any car can use any compliant unleaded gasoline at any pump, requires a broader approval framework, and getting there involves regulatory processes, infrastructure investment, and production capacity scale-up that is still in progress. Swift Fuels has been developing and marketing a 94-octane unleaded fuel called Swift 94 that serves the portion of the fleet whose engines can operate at that octane rating. For the engines it covers, this fuel is available at a growing number of airports and represents a real, usable transition product right now. The limitation is exactly what it sounds like. 94-octane does not cover the full performance requirements of the high-demand end of the fleet, so Swift 94 is not a universal answer, even though it is a real and useful answer for the aircraft it does cover. There is also a product called EAGLE, Eliminate Aviation Gasoline Lead Emissions, which is an industry coalition effort involving the FAA, ASTM International, fuel producers, and aircraft manufacturers to develop and standardize an unleaded drop-in replacement that would not require individual aircraft STCs. The goal is essentially to create a fuel that the entire fleet can use without modification, the way the auto industry transitioned away from leaded gasoline across an entire vehicle population. EAGLE has made progress. It has also encountered the technical complexity that characterizes this entire space, and the timeline for a fully standardized, universally available, drop-in 100-octane unleaded replacement remains a matter of genuine uncertainty as of today. Now I want to be very direct about what that uncertainty means in practical terms, because this is where the financial implications for individual aircraft owners get very real and very immediate. If you own a piston aircraft right now, the question you need to be sitting with is not simply whether leaded fuel will eventually go away. It will, but what the intermediate period looks like for your specific airplane, your specific engine, and your specific flying region between now and when a universally available replacement exists. Because that intermediate period is not a smooth, well-organized national transition with clear signage and a completion date stamped on it. It is going to be a messy, uneven, airport by airport, region by region, engine by engine patchwork that some owners navigate smoothly and others get caught completely flat-footed by. Let's talk about the airport infrastructure dimension of this, because it is one of the most under-discussed parts of the entire transition story. Aviation fuel distribution infrastructure, the supply chain that gets avgas from refineries to FBOs to fuel trucks to your wing tank, is not a simple commodity logistics system. It is a highly specialized, capital-intensive, liability-laden supply chain that has been built specifically around 100LL for decades. The tanks, the quality control processes, the handling equipment, the distribution contracts, the additive injection systems, all of it is calibrated for one product. Introducing a new fuel product, or transitioning away from the existing one, requires changes throughout that entire chain, and those changes cost money and require decisions by a large number of independent actors who are all making their own cost-benefit calculations about when to invest and in what. Airport fuel system operators, FBOs, airport authorities, municipal airports, have to make capital decisions about whether and when to invest in infrastructure that supports unleaded fuel alternatives, and those decisions depend on factors including what fuel approvals are actually finalized, what their specific customer base is flying and what those aircraft require, what the liability picture looks like for stocking multiple fuel types, and what their own financial situation allows. A well-capitalized FBO at a busy general aviation airport with a large local fleet may have the resources and the incentive to add unleaded fuel storage and make the transition relatively early. A small municipal airport running a break-even fuel operation on thin margins serving a handful of locally based aircraft does not have the same picture, and the transition decisions by those smaller, more marginal fuel suppliers are where the real infrastructure risk for many aircraft owners lies. What this means practically is that even as approved unleaded alternatives become available, the actual availability of those alternatives at the specific airports a given pilot uses regularly is not guaranteed and is not happening uniformly across the country. A pilot based at a well-resourced urban or suburban GA airport near a major metropolitan area is going to see the transition happen differently and probably earlier than a pilot whose flying is anchored at a small rural airport where the economics of fuel distribution have always been thin and where capital investment in new fuel infrastructure is going to be the hardest call for the airport operator to make. And here is a point that does not get made clearly enough in most discussions of this transition. The risk to small airports is not just that they will be slow to add unleaded fuel alternatives. There is a real scenario in which some small airports, faced with the cost and complexity of transitioning their fuel systems, simply exit the avgas business. There are already airports around the country where fuel availability is limited or has gone away for economic reasons entirely unrelated to the leaded fuel transition. Add the cost and uncertainty of a major fuel transition to airports that were already marginally viable as fuel suppliers, and you create genuine risk that some of those airports stop offering fuel at all, or reduce their fuel offering in ways that directly affect the range and flexibility of Piston aircraft operations in their area. For pilots who use small rural airports as fuel stops on cross-country routes, or who are based at airports where fuel supply is already limited to one source, this is not an abstract concern. The degradation of fuel availability at small airports would affect real cross-country routing, real operational range, and real mission capability in ways that are completely separate from whether your specific engine can burn the approved alternative fuel. You can have the right STC, the right engine, and a full tank at your home airport and still end up in a more operationally constrained situation if the intermediate stops you depend on start dropping out of the fuel supply network. Now let's talk about the ownership and resale value dimension, because this is where the financial picture gets really important to understand and where I think a lot of current aircraft owners are significantly underweighted in their thinking. Here is the core dynamic. Aircraft values in the piston market are established partly by physical condition, maintenance history, and avionics configuration, and partly by the aircraft's continuing utility, its ability to be flown legally, insured, fueled, and maintained going forward. Those utility factors are things buyers price in, consciously or not, when they decide what a given airplane is worth to them. An airplane that faces meaningful uncertainty about its future fuel supply, or that requires additional certification work to legally use available fuel alternatives, or that sits in a category of the fleet where the transition path is cloudier than average, carries more uncertainty than an otherwise identical airplane that doesn't have those questions hanging over it. The market has not yet fully priced this in across the entire piston fleet. That is partly because the regulatory timeline is still uncertain enough that buyers and sellers are making different assumptions about urgency, and partly because the aviation market, like most specialized asset markets, moves more slowly than broader financial markets in incorporating forward-looking risk into current pricing. But the risk is real, and the pricing will adjust as the regulatory and supply chain picture becomes clearer. The aircraft that face the most direct valuation pressure from this transition are the ones at the top of the performance range, the high-compression turbocharged engines in high-performance singles and piston twins, where the approved alternative fuel picture is still developing, where the cost of potential engine modifications to accommodate lower-octane alternatives could be substantial, and where the buyers looking at these aircraft have the most reason to apply a discount for uncertainty. A buyer shopping a high-performance turbocharged single today who asks serious questions about the fuel transition is going to factor the uncertainty into what they're willing to pay, even if they can't fully quantify the risk, because uncertainty itself carries a cost in any asset purchase. This is not to say these airplanes are going to crater in value overnight. The transition timeline has enough uncertainty and enough intermediate steps that a cliff-edge collapse in values is not the most likely scenario for most of the fleet. But a gradual compression in values for fuel transition-exposed categories of the fleet, relative to the alternatives, is a more likely outcome as the regulatory picture sharpens, and owners who are planning a sale in the next 3 to 5 years need to be thinking about that dynamic in their timing and pricing decisions. The aircraft that are best positioned through this transition, from a valuation standpoint, are the ones where approved unleaded alternatives already exist, where the conversion path is clear and affordable, and where the buyer can confidently say that the fuel transition represents a known, manageable, already solvable problem, rather than an open question. Ironically, some of the lower performance aircraft that might seem like lesser investments from a pure performance standpoint end up with a comparatively clean fuel transition picture precisely because their engines don't demand the highest octane range where the alternative fuel picture is most complicated. Let's talk about the engine modification and STC economics, because for a lot of owners this is going to be the most directly actionable part of the transition. The supplemental type certificate path for unleaded fuel compatibility means that a number of aircraft and engine combinations can be made legally compatible with approved unleaded alternatives through an STC modification that involves, in many cases, operational limitations, possibly reduced power settings under certain conditions, or in some cases, physical modifications to the engine or fuel system. The cost of these modifications varies considerably by aircraft and engine type, but it is real money. We are talking potentially several $1,000s per aircraft in some cases, more in others, depending on the specific requirements of the STC for that type. For an owner who is going to keep flying their airplane for years and wants to get ahead of the fuel transition, the STC investment might make complete sense even before the fuel availability picture fully resolves, because it expands your options and reduces your exposure to a supply disruption at a specific airport. For an owner who is planning to sell in the relatively near term, the calculus is different. You need to think about whether the STC cost comes back in the form of better buyer pricing, or whether the market hasn't yet moved enough for the STC to pay for itself at sale time. There is also the question of what happens to aircraft and engine combinations for which an STC pathway either hasn't been developed yet, or where the engineering challenges make a clean STC path uncertain. For a significant number of high-performance engine types, the current approved STC options for unleaded fuel use come with operational limitations that effectively reduce the aircraft's performance envelope under certain conditions. This is not a small thing. A buyer who purchases a high-performance aircraft specifically for its capability on hot days at high-altitude airports needs to understand clearly whether the approved unleaded fuel alternative, with its associated STC operational limits, actually supports the mission they bought the airplane for, or whether they're getting an airplane that can technically be fueled and flown, but with a performance restriction that matters for their specific use case. This is one of the conversations that is not happening loudly enough in pre-purchase inspections and dealer transactions right now, and it needs to be. A technically clean airplane that looks great on paper can have a fuel transition picture that meaningfully affects its real-world utility for a specific buyer's mission, and discovering that after the purchase is signed is a much worse experience than understanding it going in. Let me turn now to the FBO and small airport economics piece of this in more depth, because I think it is one of the most structurally underappreciated risks in the whole transition story, and one that connects directly to the practical flying environment for general aviation pilots in ways that extend far beyond just the fuel type in the tanks. The economic model of small general aviation airports is thin to begin with. A lot of small public-use airports in rural areas exist on a combination of fuel sales margins, tie-down and hangar revenue, and in many cases municipal or county subsidies. Fuel is often the most significant revenue line, and the margins on fuel are not lavish. The capital investment in fuel storage tanks, pumps, quality control testing equipment, and delivery infrastructure is substantial relative to the throughput at many small airports, and it is infrastructure that has been sitting in place and amortized over decades while the installed base remained relatively stable. Now you are asking these operations to potentially make new infrastructure investments, new or modified fuel tanks, new pumps rated for different fuel specifications, new testing and handling procedures, new supply contracts with distributors who may not yet have full national coverage for the alternative products. At a time when the fuel specifications are still evolving, the supply chain is still developing, and the liability picture for carrying a new fuel type alongside or instead of the established product is not fully settled. From the perspective of a small airport trying to survive on thin margins, the ask is genuinely difficult, and the response of many of these operators is going to be to wait as long as possible before committing capital to the transition, which means they are going to be late adopters rather than early movers. That lateness has direct consequences for the pilots who use those airports. If you are planning a cross-country route through rural areas where the fuel stops are all at small airports, the window where those airports may still be supplying only 100LL while your airplane has been converted to use an alternative fuel, or conversely still supplying only 100LL after it has become difficult to source in your home region, is a real operational planning challenge, not a theoretical one. And if some of those airports exit the fuel business entirely, rather than make the transition capital investment, the already limited cross-country fuel stop network in rural general aviation gets thinner in exactly the areas where it has the least margin to absorb thinning. There is a longer-term concern layered underneath this that is worth naming explicitly. The general aviation infrastructure in rural America, small airports, their fuel supply, their maintenance capabilities, their flight training operations, is part of what makes Piston aircraft ownership viable and practical beyond the major metropolitan areas. The slow and uneven deterioration of that infrastructure, driven in part by economics and in part by the fuel transition pressure, is not just a story about fuel availability. It is a story about whether the geographic footprint of practical general aviation shrinks over the next decade in ways that make the lifestyle proposition of aircraft ownership genuinely less valuable for a meaningful portion of current owners. A pilot who owns an airplane and has always based it at a small rural airport, using it for personal travel in a region where commercial aviation options are limited, is using that airplane in exactly the mission that small general aviation airports were built to support. If the fuel transition degrades that airport's infrastructure or pushes it out of the fuel business, it does not just create an inconvenience. It potentially changes the fundamental usefulness of that airplane for its owner in a way that is directly connected to the value of owning it at all. Let's pivot now to what all of this means for decisions you need to be making, or at least thinking through, in the relatively near term, whether you're an owner, a buyer, or someone on the fence about staying in aviation. If you currently own a Piston aircraft, the first practical step is to get genuinely clear on the fuel transition picture for your specific airframe and engine combination, not the general fleet picture, but your specific aircraft. This means understanding what fuel specifications your engine is actually certified for right now, what STC options exist for unleaded alternatives for your type, what the operational limitations of those STCs are, if any, and what the cost of obtaining and installing the relevant STCs would be for your airplane specifically. This is not information you need to guess at. It is information your airframe and engine manufacturers can provide. Your local A&P or IA should be familiar with for common types, and GAMI and Swift and the Eagle Coalition have published materials about. But you need to go get it specifically for your airplane, rather than assuming the general conversation about the fleet transition applies cleanly to your situation. The second practical step is understanding the fuel availability picture at your home airport and your most common cross-country route airports, not as a one-time snapshot, but as a dynamic situation that you should be checking on periodically. Talk to the FBO or airport manager at your home base about their transition plans. Ask directly whether they are anticipating stocking unleaded alternatives, when they think they will begin doing so, and what their contingency is for the period when 100LL becomes harder to source through their supply chain. These are conversations that FBO operators are thinking about and should be able to have, and the information you get from asking directly is far more useful than guessing based on national averages. If you are currently in the market for a Piston aircraft and haven't yet bought, the fuel transition picture should be a genuine line item in your evaluation criteria, not an afterthought. For any aircraft you are seriously considering, understand the fuel transition situation for that specific type before you commit. Is there a clean, already approved STC for an unleaded alternative? What are the operational limitations of that STC, if any? Has the manufacturer issued any guidance about future engine modifications or fuel approvals in development? The aircraft that has a clear, affordable, already executable transition path is worth more in a rigorous fuel transition-aware analysis than an otherwise identical aircraft where the transition path is murky or where the STC option available comes with significant operational restrictions. This is also a factor that interacts with the new versus used decision in ways that are worth thinking through carefully. Some newer production aircraft have been designed or updated specifically with unleaded fuel compatibility in mind from the ground up, meaning the transition story for a recent production airplane of certain types is cleaner than for an older example of the same type or a comparable older design. If you are choosing between a newer production airplane and an older one of similar capability and the price difference is close, the fuel transition clarity of the newer airplane may be a real factor in the total ownership picture over your intended holding period. For the owners of high-performance piston aircraft, the turbocharged singles, the high-compression, high-output engines in complex aircraft, I want to be direct about something that some people in this conversation dance around. The transition pathway for your category of the fleet is the least resolved, the most technically complex, and the one where the window of uncertainty is longest. That does not mean you need to sell immediately, or that your airplane is going to be worthless. It does mean that you should be the most actively engaged with what is actually happening on the fuel replacement and STC development front for your specific type, because your financial exposure to the transition playing out badly, whether that means higher conversion costs, operational limitations, value compression in resale, or real fuel availability gaps, is larger than it is for owners of lower performance aircraft with simpler fuel situations. Staying engaged means watching the FABO-PAFI updates, following the GAMI STC expansion progress for your type, staying in contact with your type club if one exists for your aircraft, because those communities often have the most current and specific information about transition developments relevant to your type, and having frank conversations with your mechanic and your insurance broker about how they see the picture evolving. The pilots who navigate this transition best are not going to be the ones who ignored it and hoped it resolved itself, and they are also not going to be the ones who panicked and made reactive decisions based on the most alarming headline they read in any given week. They are going to be the ones who stayed genuinely informed about the specific situation for their specific aircraft and made calm, deliberate decisions in response to actual developments rather than speculation. I want to spend some time on the insurance dimension of this transition as well, because it is a place where the fuel story intersects with the financial mechanics of aircraft ownership in ways that most owners have not yet thought through, and that could become significantly more relevant in the relatively near future. Right now, the fuel transition has not yet worked its way into standard aviation insurance policy language in a way that most policyholders would notice directly. But as the regulatory framework develops, and as the EPA's lead phase-out process moves further along, there is a real question about how underwriters will treat aircraft that are still operating on 100LL if and when that fuel becomes explicitly prohibited for use in that aircraft under its type certificate or applicable STCs. Insurance policies generally cover lawful operation of the aircraft, and the definition of lawful in that context could become meaningful if the regulatory landscape changes in ways that affect fuel legality for specific aircraft. This is not a warning to panic about your current policy. It is a flag that as the regulatory picture sharpens, the insurance picture will follow it, and understanding your policy's language around fuel compliance and airworthiness requirements before that becomes an urgent issue is much better than discovering it after. This is the kind of question to run by your aviation insurance broker in the context of a policy review, asking specifically whether your policy has any provisions that would be triggered by fuel-related airworthiness questions or regulatory changes affecting your type. There is a related liability angle for FBOs and fuel suppliers that is also worth understanding, even if you're looking at it from the aircraft owner's side. As unleaded alternatives become available, and ultimately as regulatory pressure increases, an FBO that continues to supply 100LL after regulatory timelines have passed, and an aircraft owner who uses that fuel in an aircraft for which it has become non-compliant, are both potentially exposed to liability questions that do not currently exist in the same form. The liability trail in general aviation maintenance and fuel quality issues is well established, and a fuel compliance question with regulatory backing behind it would be a meaningful addition to that landscape. This dynamic creates additional incentive for the transition to happen on a real timeline, rather than being indefinitely deferred by inertia, which is on one hand the right outcome for public health reasons, and on the other hand, a pressure that will accelerate the timing of decisions that aircraft owners need to be ready for. Let me address directly the question of whether this transition might effectively end general aviation as we know it, because that framing is out there, and I want to give it an honest treatment rather than just dismissing it. The concern is real in the following specific sense. If a complete and universal replacement for 100LL is not fully approved, widely available, and competitively priced before the regulatory pressure reaches a mandatory phase-out stage, there will be aircraft and engine combinations in the existing fleet that face genuine operational constraints, potentially significant ones, during the gap period between when leaded fuel becomes unavailable or legally prohibited and when the replacement infrastructure has fully built out. That gap, if it happens, is not an abstraction. It means some subset of the existing Piston fleet stops flying, either because their owners can't get the fuel they need at a practical number of airports, or because the approved alternatives come with performance restrictions that make the airplane non-viable for its intended mission. The economic cascade from that scenario would be meaningful. Aircraft that stop flying lose value. Owners who planned to sell and did not get ahead of the transition curve get caught in that value compression. Airports that were already marginal on fuel revenue lose volume faster. The secondary market for high-performance piston aircraft gets disrupted in ways that affect not just current owners, but the entire ecosystem of mechanics, parts suppliers, and training operations that support that category of flying. But here is the counterpoint that makes me less apocalyptic about this than the most alarming version of the story suggests. The economic and political stakes of getting this transition wrong for general aviation are understood by the FAA, by the EPA, by Congress, and by the industry. And the history of aviation regulation, while not fast or clean, does tend toward protecting the viability of the existing fleet, rather than simply mandating its grounding. The timeline and flexibility built into how the regulatory process works creates significant runway for the industry to develop and deploy solutions before a hard mandatory cliff, and the Eagle Initiative and the STC approval processes that are actively underway represent real, funded, staffed efforts to close the gap before it becomes catastrophic. The more realistic outcome, in my assessment, is a messy and uneven transition that disadvantages some owners of some aircraft in some regions more than others, that creates real but manageable costs and complications for a large share of the fleet, and that ultimately produces a viable unleaded fuel infrastructure for most of the piston fleet. Not on the original optimistic timeline, not on the scariest timeline, but somewhere in a range that gives most owners who are paying attention enough time to navigate if they are actually paying attention. The operators who get hurt worst in this scenario are the ones who are not paying attention, who assume it resolves itself without requiring any active decision-making on their part, and who end up making reactive decisions under pressure rather than deliberate decisions from a position of having planned ahead. Let's talk about the numbers that actually define the scale of what we're discussing, because scale matters for understanding how much pressure the transition creates, and for whom. The piston aircraft fleet in the United States is in the range of 160,000 to 170,000 aircraft, depending on how you define active aircraft versus registered but non-operational. Of those, the overwhelming majority, estimates consistently put it above 95%, currently rely on 100LL aviation gasoline as their primary or only approved fuel. The amount of leaded avgas consumed annually by the piston fleet is roughly 200 to 220 million gallons. That is the supply chain you are asking to transition, not 100,000 gallons, not a small specialty market, but a 200 million gallon annual demand that has supported a specialized refining, blending, distribution, and delivery infrastructure for decades, and that now needs to shift to a different product on a timeline being driven partly by regulatory pressure and partly by the willingness of private capital to invest in building out the alternative. On the supply side, there are currently only a handful of refineries in the United States actively producing aviation gasoline at any significant scale. The production of 100LL is already concentrated enough that supply chain disruptions at a small number of facilities would affect the entire national supply in ways that road vehicle fuel supply is insulated from by sheer scale and redundancy. This concentration is not new. It has been a structural characteristic of the avgas supply chain for a long time, but it becomes a more acute concern as regulatory pressure on leaded fuel increases, because a refinery making its capital allocation decisions for the next decade is going to think carefully about whether to continue investment in a product that is under formal regulatory phase-out pressure, even if the specific phase-out timeline is not yet locked in. This is a dynamic that could produce supply pressures even ahead of any formal regulatory prohibition, simply because capital naturally flows away from products facing regulatory extinction even before the formal extinction date arrives. We have seen this pattern in other industrial transitions: coal, leaded road fuel, certain refrigerants, where market pricing and supply investment begin adjusting to the anticipated end state before the regulatory timeline forces it, creating a supply squeeze that precedes the official prohibition and accelerates the transition in a way that is messier than the formal regulatory timeline alone would suggest. For aircraft owners, this means the relevant timeline for fuel availability concerns may be shorter than the formal regulatory rulemaking calendar implies, because the market dynamics in the avgas supply chain can move faster than the regulatory process. Staying aware of what is happening at the refinery and distribution level, not just what the EPA is doing in its rulemaking calendar, is part of a complete picture of this transition. I want to talk about some specific categories of aircraft owner and what the transition picture looks like specifically for each, because the experience of this transition is not the same for everyone in the fleet, and the relevant decisions are genuinely different depending on where you sit. If you own a simple fixed-gear four-cylinder piston single that operates comfortably on lower-octane fuels, the kind of airplane many private pilots use for personal travel and weekend flying, your transition picture is comparatively manageable. Approved alternatives that cover your octane requirements already exist and are available at a growing number of airports. The STC path for your airplane type is either already executed or well-defined and affordable. The main risk you face is the infrastructure and availability risk at smaller airports in rural areas, which is real but manageable, with some planning around your cross-country routing and fuel stops. You should be paying attention to this. You should understand your specific fuel situation, but you are not in the most exposed position in the fleet. If you own a high-performance retractable single with a turbocharged engine that genuinely needs the octane headroom of 100LL for its design performance envelope, your transition picture is more complex. The approved alternatives for your type may come with operational limitations that matter for your specific mission. The STC development timeline for your type may still be in progress. The resale market for your category of aircraft is the one most sensitive to fuel transition uncertainty in the near term. You need to be more actively engaged, more specific in your information gathering, and more deliberate in your timing of any ownership decisions in the next several years. If you own a piston twin, the picture is similar to the high-performance single in terms of fuel requirement, with the additional complexity that piston twin ownership is already more expensive and operationally demanding than single-engine ownership, and the buyer pool for used piston twins has been thinning for demographic and financial reasons that compound the fuel transition uncertainty. The combination of those factors, thinner buyer pool, fuel transition uncertainty, high operating costs, creates a more challenging resale picture for piston twin owners over the next several years than the fuel story alone would suggest. If you are a flight school operator, the transition creates a specific and immediate business planning challenge. Your fleet is almost certainly currently dependent on 100LL. Your utilization model depends on rapid fueling turnarounds, and you are both an early potential adopter of unleaded alternatives and a business that cannot absorb a fuel supply disruption without direct impact on your ability to generate revenue. The clearest path for flight schools is probably through the lower performance aircraft categories, where approved alternatives are already available and the STC path is clear. And schools that are at the point of fleet renewal decisions should be weighting the fuel transition picture heavily in their acquisition choices rather than simply rebuying what they already have. Now let me talk about what I think the next 3 to 5 years actually look like in realistic terms, not best case, not worst case, but the most probable path, given what is actually happening. In the near term, 100LL remains available at most airports because the regulatory and supply chain transition has not advanced far enough to produce widespread availability gaps. Prices for 100LL may increase relative to alternative fuels as refinery investment decisions begin reflecting the product's long-term trajectory, but supply does not simply disappear overnight. During this period, the STC approval process for additional aircraft and engine types continues, coverage of the fleet under unleaded alternative STCs expands, and a growing number of airports in better resourced markets begin stocking unleaded alternatives alongside 100LL. In the middle of the range, call it years 2 through 5 on a rough timeline, the approved coverage of the fleet under unleaded alternative STCs reaches a majority of the fleet by numbers. Availability of the